Japanese pilots shit their pants when they saw American tigers in the sky. This is not a hyperbole. It was a fact. It was a new, terrifying law of nature they learned in the skies over China. But before December 20th, 1941, they didn't know that yet. Until that day, they were gods. Saturday morning, December 20th, 1941. From an airfield in Hanoi, Indochina, 10 Japanese twin-engine Mitsubishi Ki-21 bombers roared into the sky, Sallies, as the Allies called them. They were loaded with 500-pound bombs, plus incendiary mixtures. Their target, the city of Kunming, the Chinese end of the famous Burma Road. For the Japanese pilots, this wasn't a combat sortie. It was a stroll, routine. They had been doing this for a whole year. On any clear day, they would arrive, drop their deadly cargo on the defenseless city with impunity. They flew without an escort. Why would they need one? The Chinese had no fighters, no anti-aircraft guns. The sky belonged to them. To them, the sons of the emperor. They were going to pass over Kunming at an altitude of 6,000 feet in a majestic, deadly procession like God's delivering justice. They were arrogant, they were self-assured, they were doomed. They did not know that down below, in caves a few miles from the city, the Chinese early warning system was already at work. Observers were glued to their instruments, listening to the sky. They heard them. When the Japanese bombers were 30 miles from Kunming, they suddenly saw something they had never seen before, something that was not supposed to exist. 4 high-speed fighters coming straight at them. On the noses of these planes were painted toothy predatory shark mouths. They were Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks. They were Americans. They were the Flying Tigers. The Japanese pilots froze in shock for a moment. What the hell was this? Where did they come from? But there was no time to think. The Americans, led by Lieutenant Jack Newkirk, smashed into their formation like a pack of wolves into a flock of sheep. 50 caliber machine guns tore the sky apart. The thick skin of the Japanese bombers, which had seemed like armor to them, ripped like paper. 4 bombers exploded one after another, turning into fireballs. The Japanese gunners opened a chaotic fire in a panic, but it was too late. Order turned into chaos. The majestic procession into a flock of terrified ducks. The survivors, not even thinking about the target, dropped their bombs just anywhere, then, with smoking engines, turned back to flee to Hanoi. Not a single American plane was lost. They returned to Kunming. In front of an ecstatic crowd, they performed slow, arrogant victory rolls over their airfield. It was their first battle. It was their first slaughter. Intelligence later reported that 3 more of those that had fled never made it back to their base. When the pilots landed, they were met by their commander, a stern, bony man with a weather-beaten face, Lieutenant Colonel Claire Chennault. He listened to their excited reports, praised them, then added in his signature dry voice that next time they should get them all. This was only the beginning. The Germans in Europe already knew what American fury was. Now, it was the Japanese's turn. 3 days later, on December 23rd, the war came to Rangoon. A dozen Tomahawks from the Hells Angels squadron, along with a few outdated British Buffaloes, intercepted a Japanese bomber armada. The result? 5 bombers, 4 enemy fighters turned into scrap. The Americans lost 1 plane. For Chennault, this was a bad trade. He valued his pilots, his planes, of which he had damn few. But the real hell for the Japanese came on Christmas. December 25th, they decided to give Rangoon a present. 71 Sally bombers, escorted by 40 fighters. They came in, confident in their numerical superiority. They flew into an American buzzsaw. 12 Hells Angels, 18 British Buffaloes met them, but they didn't fight like Europeans getting into elegant dogfights. They fought the way Chennault had taught them. Brutally, effectively. They worked in pairs. One attacks, the other covers. They used the main advantage of their heavy P-40, its speed in a dive. They would fall on the Japanese formations from above like falcons, making a single deadly pass, shooting up everything in their path. Without engaging in a maneuvering fight, they would dive away at full speed, then climb again for the next strike. It was a hit-run tactic. It turned the Japanese armada into a bloody mess. The bombers exploded one after another. The Japanese pilots in their light maneuverable Zeros, accustomed to nightly duels, simply did not understand what was happening. They only saw blurred silhouettes flashing past, leaving death in their wake. Before we begin, I just want to say one thing. This channel tells the stories of people forged from steel and fire, not ordinary flesh and blood. Those who fought for our future deserve to be remembered, If you believe that too, please subscribe. Every video here honors their memory. I voice each story myself because they deserve a human voice, not a cold AI one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if your family went through that terrible war, share a few words about them. Let's remember them together. All right, let's get to the story. That day, 32 Japanese planes were claimed as shot down. The Americans lost 2 Tomahawks, not a single pilot. 3 of the Tigers became aces in a single day. This was just the beginning of their legend. In 7 months of combat from December 1941 to July 1942, this small band of mercenaries, which never had more than 50 combat-ready pilots, unleashed a true genocide on the Japanese Air Forces. They claimed 297 confirmed victories, another 240 probables, with 40 aircraft destroyed on the ground. They lost only 4 pilots in air combat. They were not just soldiers. They were the only mercenary air force in the Second World War. Adventurers, rebels, idealists, who had signed a 1-year contract with the Chinese government. They were paid from $250 to $750 a month, plus $500 for every Japanese plane shot down. They had come here for money, for adventure. They found glory here. At a time when America, humiliated after Pearl Harbor, was suffering defeat after defeat, these guys on the other side of the world, in outdated planes, were proving every day it's better not to mess with Americans. At a time when America, humiliated after Pearl Harbor, was suffering defeat after defeat, this band of mercenaries on the other side of the world was giving the Japanese hell every single day. They became a sensation. Newspapers, radio, comic books, everyone was shouting about the Flying Tigers. They were the heroes the nation so desperately needed. They were the proof that the American spirit could not be broken. But the truth was that this incredible success story had nothing to do with American foresight. On the contrary, it was a story born in spite of it. It was a story of how the American military machine, blind, arrogant, had thrown its most brilliant tactician onto the scrap heap. That tactician was the founding father of the Flying Tigers, Colonel Claire Chennault. To understand how the Tigers were able to dominate the sky, you have to understand who this man was. Chennault was not just an officer, he was a rebel, a heretic. He was a pain in the ass for the entire command of the U.S. Army Air Corps. In the 1930s, the American military aviation was obsessed with one idea, one religion, the religion of the invincibility of the heavy bomber. The generals, the bomber mafia, believed that armadas of flying fortresses, protected by dozens of machine guns, could break through any defense, could grind any city to dust. In this doctrine, the fighter was relegated to the role of a second-rate auxiliary weapon. Chennault laughed in their faces. He, a combat pilot, a practitioner, not a theorist, had spent 5 years trying to get through to them. He argued that a well-organized pack of fighters could tear any bomber armada to shreds. He proved that the future of air warfare belonged to the fighter. The Royal Air Force proved him right in the skies over Britain in 1940, but the American generals were deaf. Chennault was a man cut from a different cloth, a descendant of French Huguenots, a distant relative of General Robert E. Lee. He grew up in the swamps of Louisiana. He was a hunter, a fisherman, a man of the land. He spent so much time in the sun and the wind that his skin became rough, cracked like old leather. Later, his pilots would give him the nickname Old Leatherface. He was quiet, reserved, but a wild, untamable fire burned inside him. He fell in love with aviation after seeing a biplane at a county fair. He wrote to his father that he had tasted the air, that he couldn't get it out of his mind. He became a pilot. He became the best. But his mind was too sharp, his tongue too blunt for the Army bureaucracy. He openly criticized the outdated doctrine of the Air Corps. He argued that the dogfight tactics inherited from the First World War were a medieval jousting tournament, not modern warfare. He wrote that there was too much nobility, too little of the cold, hard business of war. He believed that individuals did not win. Teams won. Packs. To prove his point, he with 2 other pilots formed an aerobatic team called 3 Men on a Flying Trapeze. They performed breathtaking maneuvers in tight formation, proving that a group of planes could move as a single organism. But the Air Corps hierarchy was blind. In 1936, the tactical school where he taught stopped teaching fighter tactics altogether. For Chennault, this was the end. In 1937, at the age of 47, with partial deafness, chronic bronchitis, he retired. He was exhausted, unpopular. His brilliant ideas were sinking in the swamp of army stupidity. Many generals breathed a sigh of relief. The U.S. Army had cast out its best thinker, but others had noticed him. The Chinese. At that time, China had been bleeding under the boot of Japanese invaders for years. Its air force was in a pitiful state. On paper, 500 planes. In reality, 91, those barely staying in the air. Japanese bombers were burning their cities with impunity. The situation was hopeless. So they called Chennault. In May of 1937, he arrived in China. His mission was to build a new air force from the ashes. He met with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the wife of the Chinese leader. She was not just the first lady, she was a colonel in the Chinese Air Force, was in charge of its modernization. She saw in this grim, bony American what his own generals had not. She saw a genius. "She will always be a princess to me," he wrote in his diary. She became his patron, his protector. Chennault began his work. He revamped the training system. He taught new tactics. Most importantly, he created a vast early warning network across China using radios, telephones, thousands of observers. This was his old idea, the one ridiculed in the U.S. Here, it became their main trump card. His pilots began to fight. They fought desperately, but there were too few of them. Their planes were too old. When the Japanese Zero fighter appeared in the sky, the situation became catastrophic. In the summer of 1940, the key city of Chongqing was being bombed by 100 Japanese planes a day. The Chinese Air Force had ceased to exist. So Chiang Kai-shek decided on a desperate move. He sent Chennault back to America with an impossible mission: to get American planes for China. More importantly, to get American pilots. In early 1941, Claire Chennault returned to America. But it was not the return of a hero. It was the return of an exile. The man the American military machine had spat out like trash now had to come to that same machine to beg for weapons, for men, for a miracle. His mission wasn't just difficult, it felt impossible. America was still neutral. It was hiding behind its oceans, pretending the war in Europe, in Asia, did not concern it. Selling weapons to China? Maybe. But allowing American military pilots to fight under a foreign flag? That was a direct violation of neutrality. It was a declaration of war America was not yet ready for. But Chennault had some aces up his sleeve. First, his patroness, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. Second, her brother TV Sung. He was not just a politician. He was a genius of backroom deals, the head of the Bank of China, his country's chief lobbyist in Washington. He knew which levers to pull. He knew whose doors to open. They began their game. Chennault Sung made the rounds in Washington, pleading, persuading, blackmailing. They went all the way to the top to President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, reluctantly under pressure, finally gave his consent, but it was a consent given in a whisper. On April 15, 1941, he signed a secret, unpublished executive order that allowed U.S. Army Reserve officers to resign from service to work for a private company. This company was a pure fiction. It was called China Defense Supplies. It was registered in the state of Delaware. Madame Chiang Kai-shek personally transferred almost $9 million to its account. This was money for weapons. Chennault knew what weapon he needed. He didn't ask for the best. He knew he wouldn't get it. He asked for what nobody else wanted. He found it. 100 Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk fighters. These were not new planes. This was junk. These were planes intended for Britain, but the Royal Air Force had rejected them. They looked at them, said, "No thanks. Obsolete." For Chennault, this was perfect. It was a plane he knew, heavy, tough, with thick armor. It couldn't compete in a turning fight with a Japanese Zero, but it could dive like a devil. It could take damage that would turn a Zero to ash. It was not a scalpel, it was a hammer. Chennault was going to use it to drive nails into the coffin of the Japanese Air Force. Now he needed pilots. The recruitment began. Recruiters started visiting military bases across the U.S. Army, the Navy. They weren't looking for patriots, they were looking for adventurers. Men who were bored, men who craved glory, money, a real fight. They told the young pilots this was their chance to get real combat experience. Besides, it paid well. The terms were sweet: a one-year contract, a salary of $250 to $750 a month, plus free housing, food, even a personal servant interpreter. The cherry on top, $500 in cash for every Japanese plane shot down. For young guys making pennies in the Army, this was a fortune. They went. Pilots from aircraft carriers, Pilots from fighter squadrons, commercial pilots, test pilots, about half from the Navy, the Marine Corps, a third from the Army Air Corps. These were not angels, they were rebels, hotshots, men who felt constrained by military discipline. They were the perfect men for Chennault. In July of 1941, the first batch, 110 pilots, 150 mechanics, sailed from San Francisco. It was not a military transport, it was a clandestine voyage. Due to neutrality laws, they traveled with fake passports. They posed as bankers, actors, priests, even circus performers. They carried with them their dreams of glory, suitcases full of contracts. Through Singapore, they reached Burma. Their new home was to be the airfield at Taungoo. But airfield was too grand a word. It was just a strip of land hacked out of the jungle. A former abandoned RAF base. When Chennault arrived there on August 22nd, he saw a living hell. His elite American pilots were living in grass huts. They were suffocating from the unbearable heat, the humidity. Their food was terrible. The mosquitoes that carried malaria were eating them alive. He saw this mob of adventurers suffering from hangovers, from dysentery. He saw their outdated, disassembled planes lying in crates. He started his work. He didn't waste time on drills. He started teaching them how to kill. He gathered them in a dusty room, began to draw on a blackboard. He explained his philosophy, the philosophy the American Army had rejected. He told them something that contradicted everything they had been taught. He told them, looking them in the eye, that they should never, ever, for God's sake, try to turn fight a Japanese Zero in a P-40. He said, "Believe me, tricks like that are not conducive to a long life." He taught them not to fight like gentlemen. He taught them to fight like killers, like a pack. He taught them to use the strengths of their junk, toughness, dive speed, firepower. He drilled into them to use their speed, their diving power to make one pass, you fire, you get the hell out. No dogfights, no chivalry, just cold, brutal efficiency. Hit, kill, disappear. He was like a football coach drawing plays on a blackboard. He would sit for hours on a rickety bamboo tower, watching their training through binoculars, shouting curses, advice into the radio. The training was slow, bloody. 3 pilots died in accidents before they ever saw the enemy. Others just gave up, went home. Torrential rains turned the airfield into a swamp, grounding the planes for long periods. But those who stayed were being forged into a weapon of Chennault's own making. They didn't know it yet, but they were preparing to become the worst nightmare of the Japanese Air Force. They were preparing to become the Flying Tigers. When the Flying Tigers were finally ready, Pearl Harbor was hit. America, humiliated, enraged, suddenly realized that this strange, semi-legal band of mercenaries on the other side of the world was the only thing it had. It was the only force that was already in the fight, the only force that was already spilling Japanese blood. Chennault let his tigers out of the cage. He divided his small army, one group he kept in Kunming, to defend the skies over China. The other he sent to Burma to help the British, who were barely holding on against the onslaught of the Japanese imperial machine. This was not an army. It was a circus, an improvisation. They had nothing. Spare parts had to be shipped thousands of miles by sea, by rail, then over the Himalayas. It was as if, Chennault said, an Air Force based in Kansas was being supplied from San Francisco to bomb targets from Maine to Florida. But the American spirit could not be defeated by logistics. When they got holes in their fuel tanks, they patched them with chewing gum. When they ran out of incendiary bombs, they filled whiskey bottles with gasoline, making improvised napalm. They went to work. The Japanese, used to an easy ride, suddenly realized a new predator had appeared in the sky, a predator that didn't play by the rules. Very soon, Radio Tokyo began to scream hysterically. The announcer declared that the American pilots in Chinese planes were unprincipled bandits. He threatened that if they did not stop their unorthodox tactics, they would be treated as partisans. This was not just a statement, it was a threat. It meant that any captured Tiger pilot would not be taken prisoner, but executed on the spot. It was supposed to scare them. Instead, it only made them angrier. They were not soldiers, they were mercenaries, bandits. They accepted the nickname with pride. They began not just to fight, but to play with the minds of the Japanese pilots. When they went on the air, they would change their voices, give orders to imaginary squadrons, creating the impression that there were 10 times more of them in the sky. The Japanese pilots, hearing this chaos on the air, would panic, retreat, afraid of falling into a trap that didn't exist. But the real hell for the Japanese began in February of 1942. February 25th, the Japanese decided to wipe Rangoon off the face of the earth. They sent an armada, 166 planes, bombers, fighters. They came in, confident in their invincibility. They met asterisk, asterisk, 9, asterisk, asterisk, P-40s. This was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Tigers fell on them from high altitude, using their hit-run tactics. They sliced through the Japanese formation like a hot knife through butter, tearing the bombers to pieces. In a few minutes, it was all over. 24 Japanese planes became burning wreckage. The Americans lost 3. The next day, the Japanese decided it had been a fluke. They decided to get revenge. They sent an even bigger armada, about 200 planes. This time, Chennault could only scramble asterisk, asterisk, 6, asterisk, asterisk, Tomahawks. 6 American mercenaries in outdated planes against 200 Japanese. It should have been suicide. It should have been their end. Instead, it became their legend. The 6 Tigers dove on the Japanese armada again. They fought with the fury of the doomed. They tore apart 18 Japanese planes. They returned to base without a single loss. The Japanese pilots were in shock. They didn't understand what was happening. They had encountered something they couldn't explain. They had encountered American fury. That's when the legend was born. The legend of the Flying Tigers. They began to paint terrifying, toothy shark mouths on the noses of their planes, a design they had shamelessly borrowed from the RAF's 112th Squadron. Then an artist from the Walt Disney Studio designed an official emblem for them, a winged Bengal tiger leaping through a V for victory sign. They weren't just a squadron, they were a brand. That brand struck terror. They were far from the ideal image of a soldier. They wore cowboy boots, they got drunk in the bars of Rangoon, they made up bawdy ballads. They only wore their full-dress uniforms for the funerals of their comrades. Discipline was an empty word for them. The only thing that mattered was the number of Japanese planes shot down. In that, they had no equal. 26 aces came from their ranks. One of them, Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, would later lead the legendary Black Sheep Marine Squadron, becoming one of the top aces in American history. But their success depended not only on the pilots, it depended on the men on the ground, on their mechanics. While the Japanese aces had entire factories behind them, supplying them with new planes, with spare parts, the Tigers' mechanics had only their own ingenuity. They worked in inhuman conditions, in sub-zero temperatures on the Kunming Plateau, in 115-degree heat in the jungles of Burma. They repaired bullet-riddled planes during enemy air raids. There were no spare parts. So they crawled through the jungle, through rice paddies, collecting wreckage from downed planes to salvage any part they could. They were masters of improvisation. They even waxed the fuselages to increase the speed by 10 miles per hour. One of the pilots said to leave a few loud words for their ground crews. He said they had been through strafing, dodged bombs, were always there at all hours, working on their ships. This was a team, a pack of American wolves in tiger skin. They were tearing at the throat of the Japanese war machine while their own country was just beginning to wake up. The battle for Rangoon was lost, not by the Tigers, by the British. Despite the heroism of the American mercenaries who had given the Japanese a bloodbath in the sky, on the ground, everything was falling apart. On March 7, 1942, Rangoon fell. Chennault, realizing his small pack couldn't fight the entire Japanese army, gave the order, retreat. He took his last battle-scarred Tomahawks from Burma, returned to China. Their role had changed. Now they weren't just defenders. They were China's only hope. The only force that could in any way hold back the Japanese war machine. They defended the cities of western China. Like ghosts, they would launch daring raids over Burma, attacking Japanese columns to protect the single thread that connected China to the world, the winding, dangerous Burma Road. But their main war was now fought, not in the sky, it was fought on the ground. It was a war with logistics, a war they could not win. Every bolt, every spark plug, every bullet, all of it had to be brought thousands of miles by sea to India, then by rail, then by planes over the Himalayas, over the hump, the most dangerous air route in the world, or by trucks, by donkeys over makeshift roads that ran through mountains, through jungles. Chennault said it was as if an Air Force based in Kansas was being supplied from San Francisco to bomb targets from Maine to Florida. This wasn't just a problem, it was a logistical nightmare. In this nightmare, his Tigers continued to work miracles, but their time was running out. Their one-year contracts were ending. America, now fully in the war, wanted its heroes back. On July 4th, 1942, on American Independence Day, the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, ceased to exist. It was not a triumphant finale. For many of the pilots, it felt like a betrayal. They, the mercenaries, the rebels who had first shown the world how to kill the Japanese, were now simply being disbanded. They were to be absorbed into the regular U.S. Army Air Forces. A new structure, the China Air Task Force, took their place. Their operations were inherited by the 23rd Fighter Group. Many of the Tigers refused to join the regular army, went home, the legend had ended, but one man remained, Claire Chennault. He had returned to service in the U.S. Army in April of 1942 as a colonel. He, the outcast who had once been pushed into retirement, was now being begged to return. He was promoted to brigadier general. He took command of the new China Air Task Force. His nightmare only intensified. Now he had to fight not just the Japanese, he had to fight the American bureaucracy, plus one man who hated him with every fiber of his being. General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell. Stilwell was the commander of all American ground forces in China. He was an infantryman to the bone. He hated aviation. He considered it an auxiliary, secondary force. For him, the infantry was everything. He despised Chennault, despised him as an upstart, as a rebel, as a man who had direct access to President Roosevelt, to Chiang Kai-shek. This was not just a clash of personalities. It was a clash of philosophies. Chennault believed he could win the war in China from the air. He demanded planes, bombers, fighters. He wanted to destroy the Japanese Air Force, to bomb their supply lines, to force them to retreat. Stilwell thought this was madness. He wanted aviation only to support his ground operations. He constantly took Chennault's precious planes, sent them to strafe enemy positions where they were shot down by flak. Most importantly, Stilwell controlled logistics. He controlled the pathetic trickle of supplies that came over the hump. He gave priority to his infantry. Chennault got the leftovers. His planes sat without fuel. His machine guns were silent for lack of bullets. It was a war on two fronts. But Chennault did not give up. He complained. He yelled. He wrote letters directly to Washington. Over Stilwell's head, he earned the distrust of the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall. He became a problem. But he got results. Even with the crumbs he was given, his pilots continued to work miracles. They dominated the sky. They made the Japanese pay in blood for every inch of Chinese soil. Eventually, Washington understood. They understood that Chennault wasn't just a problem. He was their only hope in China. In March of 1943, he was promoted to Major General. He was given what he had been fighting for. He was given his own Air Force, the 14th U.S. Air Force. Now, Old Leatherface had his own kingdom, but it was a kingdom that stood on the edge of an abyss. He was still at the end of the longest, thinnest supply chain in the world. He still had to fight not only the Japanese, but also Stilwell. He still had to work miracles. He began to work them. He got new, more modern aircraft. He got new young pilots hungry for a fight. He unleashed them. He began his own private war against the Japanese Empire. This war was brutal, effective, utterly American. The legend of the Flying Tigers was over, but Claire Chennault's war was just beginning. In March of 1943, the American command finally accepted the inevitable. They realized that this prickly, stubborn, insufferable rebel they had once kicked out was the only man on the planet who knew how to kill the Japanese in the skies over China. They gave him what he craved. They gave him his own Air Force, the 14th U.S. Air Force. Old Leatherface got his kingdom. He unleashed hell. But it was a kingdom of beggars. He was a king who ruled over a junkyard. He was still at the end of the longest, thinnest supply chain in the world, a chain that ran through the icy nightmare of the hump. He still had to fight not only the Japanese, but also his chief enemy in an American uniform, General Vinegar Joe Stilwell. This war between two American generals was just as vicious as the war with the Japanese. Stilwell, an infantryman to the bone, was strangling Chennault's Air Force, taking his fuel, his planes, his men. But Chennault was not just a soldier. He was a politician. He wrote letters over Stilwell's head, straight to the White House, straight to Chiang Kai-shek. He became a pain in the ass for the entire high command, but he got results. Even with the crumbs he was given, his pilots continued to work miracles. His 14th Air Force became the most effective military unit in all of China. They dominated the sky. They made the Japanese pay in blood for every inch of Chinese soil. He remained in command of the 14th Air Force until the very end, until August of 1945. He outlasted Stilwell. He outlasted all his critics. He proved his point not with words, but with deeds. With the number of Japanese planes shot down, with the number of Japanese ships sunk, he was a rebel. He was a heretic. He was old Leatherface, kicked out by his own army. He became the man who single-handedly saved China from total collapse, who gave the Japanese hell in the sky. In October of 1945, after Japan's surrender, he retired. The war was over. It seemed the story was finished, but for Claire Chennault, the war never ended. He returned to China, not as a soldier, as a civilian. He saw what the blind politicians in Washington did not. He saw the country he had fought for which his men had died, sinking into a new, even more terrible darkness. He saw the communist plague of Mao Zedong, supported by the Soviet Union, begin to devour China. He began to shout again. He criticized the American government for abandoning its allies, the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek. He warned of the communist threat, but again, no one listened to him. He was once again a heretic, a rebel who saw a truth that everyone else preferred to ignore. So he did what he did best. He took action. In 1946, he once again joined Chiang Kai-shek, created an airline. On paper, it was a civilian organization for transporting humanitarian aid. In reality, it was his private air force, which continued to fight the communists. He remained there until 1950, until the very end, until the communists had taken over the entire country. He returned to America a defeated man, but not a broken one. He hadn't lost a battle. He had lost a war to politicians who had betrayed his cause. In January of 1958, he came home for good. He was sick. Lung cancer, the same tobacco that had helped him endure the stress of war, was now killing him. On July 27th of that year, he died in New Orleans. One of the last to visit him on his deathbed was her, his princess, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. America, which had so often rejected him, finally recognized its hero. 9 days before his death, the U.S. Air Force awarded him the honorary rank of Lieutenant General. He was buried with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. An Air Force base was named after him. They even issued a postage stamp in the capital of Taiwan, Taipei. A bust of him was erected. He became the only Westerner to be honored in such a way in the Republic of China. But his true legacy was not in bronze or granite. It was in a legend, the legend of the Flying Tigers. Of a band of mercenaries who, in outdated junk, under the command of a cast-off general, gave the invincible Japanese Air Force hell. This legend entered America's bloodstream. It became part of the nation's DNA. Captain Robert Scott, one of the Tigers, wrote a book about them called God is My Co-Pilot. It became a bestseller. Then Hollywood made a movie, Flying Tigers, starring John Wayne. The whole world saw them, not as soldiers, but as American cowboys. Audacious, self-confident, drinking whiskey, getting into bar fights, killing Japanese with a smile on their faces. It wasn't entirely true, but it was the truth America needed. A story that even when you're betrayed by your own generals, even when you're given the worst weapons, even when the enemy is stronger, smarter, more numerous, the American spirit will still win. Because it's made of something different. Claire Chennault was the proof. He was the proof that sometimes, to win a war, you have to say to hell with the rules, just let the wolves do their job. The story of Claire Chennault, his Flying Tigers, is the ultimate American legend of the rebels who turned out to be more right than all the generals. Write in the comments what you think was the main reason for their success. Chennault's brilliant tactics, the American audacity of the pilots, or the fact that the Japanese just weren't ready for such naked, brutal fury. The memory of them is alive as long as we speak of them. But this story is not the end. Right now, 2 more legends are appearing on your screen. 2 incredible tales of men forged from steel, from fire. If you have the time, dedicate it to the memory of more heroes. Thank you for watching.